The original American Constitution had just 7 articles. This Constitution for Europe contains 448, which originally covered 800 pages. In some ways, this Constitution is just another treaty because it incorporates all the earlier treaties, but it makes the intention to set up a European government much more obvious than ever before. It gives the European Union, the Union as they now call it, pretty well all the attributes of a fully fledged state, with its own flag, its own currency, its own foreign and defence policies, its own courts and legal officers, its own federal police force. It gives the Union for the first time its own legal personality, with the right to behave on the international stage just like any sovereign government. It recognises for the first time in a treaty the principle that the laws of the Union are superior in every respect to those made by national parliaments and courts. It marks a further massive handing over of powers from national governments to the central government in Brussels. It greatly extends the areas of life where Brussels has the power to dictate policies and laws. It also reduces almost to vanishing point the right of national governments to veto laws which they do not consider in their country's interests. It includes all the 54 articles of the so-called Charter of Fundamental Rights, the document which we were told by a British minister would have no more legal significance than a copy of the Sun newspaper or the Beano. What this document confirms, in short, is the desire to set up a supranational government which is not elected and which the peoples of Europe cannot call to account or dismiss. It marks the transformation of Europe, in effect, into a one-party state. Yet this is what the governments of Europe agreed to in our name in 2004. Only in 2005, when it was rejected by the voters of France and Holland, did the plan to impose this constitution on us all at last run into a mighty obstacle. For the moment, it has been put on ice, but there are plenty of people at the top in Europe who are looking for ways to bring it back onto the agenda. Meanwhile, they are already pushing ahead with many of its contents, from a European space programme to a common defence policy, just as if their constitution was already legally in force. They are not going to give up.
The EU constitution sweeps up those few areas of governmental power that still, just about, remain British. But what about our economy? Whoever controls the currency controls the country, and at the moment we still have our own currency, the pound sterling. Signing up to the EU constitution would undoubtedly increase the pressure on Britain to enter the single currency. This would mean Britain's economy being controlled by the foreign bankers of the European Central Bank in Frankfurt. Ian Milne has been looking at EU economics.
There's a huge misconception that the EU political economic model represents the future. Big mistake. Let me explain. The EU model is copied nowhere in the developed world. The relatively few customs unions that do exist are in poor African and Latin American countries, former Soviet satellites, and some of the Gulf states. But outside Europe, no major industrial trading nation, not the USA, not Japan, not South Korea, not Singapore, not Australia, not Chile, has chosen to conduct its trade via an EU-type customs union and single market. Neither, and here's the killer fact, have tomorrow's economic giants, China and India. All have chosen user-friendly, light-touch, government-to-government arrangements. That's the future, trade-wise. The claim that the UK needs the EU for its trade and jobs is an empty one. Over 90% of the UK economy is not involved in exporting to the EU. The USA, not in the EU, sells more to the EU than the UK does, without paying a penny to Brussels or imposing 1 ounce of EU regulation on the US economy. The UK has a huge and growing deficit on its trade with continental Europe, and the cost of UK membership of the EU massively outweighs the benefit. British access to the 6% of the world's population living in the EU costs us a fortune. The Treasury hands over £250 million of our taxes to Brussels every single week. British access to the other 94% of the world's population outside the EU is free. The fact is, the EU is the past. invented in the 1950s to meet the failures of the 1930s. But in tomorrow's world, it'll soon be an irrelevance, overshadowed by the USA, China and India, all of which, as it happens, conduct their business in English. Those are the countries we have to be free to engage with, as equals, to build a better world in the 21st century. It's time this country got out and embraced the future.
So our political power has been handed away, our constitutional power is planned to go, and our economic power is being seriously threatened. All this was planned and must happen if the EU is to control us completely. But that isn't enough. Everything that is British must go, and that's where local government plays its part in dismantling the British state. Part of the political takeover is the hollowing out process Christopher Booker spoke of earlier, and the pretense that our Parliament still governs Britain, whilst in reality it is merely the puppet of Brussels. Eventually, Westminster will cease to exist, and 12 regional governments, answerable to Brussels, will take over. This breakup of Britain has been investigated by Lindsay Jenkins.
For generations, we in the United Kingdom have enjoyed democratic local government. We've elected councillors for our town or county councils. Many of us have volunteered to be parish councillors, unpaid, to do our bit for the village. But within a year or two, it will all be gone. Most of it has gone already. The Treaty of Rome was the death knell for democratic government. Today, county, borough and parish councils are all giving way to regions, to sub-regions and sub-sub-regions, the European Union's system of local government. But it's taken time to destroy what was British and replace it with the European model. John Major began the rot with government offices in the regions, new divisions, never before known in this country. But when Tony Blair won that landslide victory in 1997, the destruction accelerated. London, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland now have their own elected assemblies. The one in Edinburgh is grandly called a parliament. They may think they have a large measure of independence and freedom, but each is just a region in the European Union. And what about the rest of England? That's divided into 8 regions, the South West, the South East, the East Midlands and so on, but with appointed assemblies. When people in the North East gave a resounding thumbs down to an elected assembly, the appointed assembly just carried on regardless. But assemblies don't matter. Elected or not, they're just wallpaper. One assembly member told me that he got his massive pile of papers just days before a meeting, and he had no real idea of what was going on. Only the few who drive this process know. They're the assembly officers, the permanent staff, confident, powerful, professional. They're the real power brokers. It's a charade of democracy. The new regions are getting more and more power. Planning. How we can use our land, British land, has already been removed from elected local and county councils and is directed from Brussels. Every region's plans now have to fit into the Brussels plan. Soon it will be the turn of the police and their super-regional forces. Will they answer to the European Union's police force, Europol, in The Hague? Soon London will be just a regional capital and not a focus of the nation-state, because there won't be a nation-state, just a collection of European regions. Britain will have disappeared.
As you have seen, since 1972, the balkanization of Britain into 12 EU provinces has continued apace, so that today the process of deconstructing Britain is almost complete. And there is nothing our politicians seem willing to do about it, albeit that it is in defiance of our own constitution. So, is this the end of Britain and the right of the British to govern themselves? Is EU membership, as some would have you believe, inevitable? And is there an alternative to being part of a European federal state? Well, here are two views of the future from two very different standpoints. First, Ian Milne again.
The story of the next 50 years is going to be the rise and rise of the world outside the EU, where the other 94% of the population of the planet lives. In that vibrant, growing 94%, the independent, self-governing nation is the rule, not the exception. Our English-speaking cousins in America, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, Singapore are proud to be self-governing nations. The world's second biggest economy, Japan, is proud to be a self-governing nation. So are those coming superpowers, China and India. For all these countries, big and small, the idea of surrendering the power to govern themselves, as Britain has done, to a supranational bureaucracy, and a corrupt one at that, is literally incomprehensible. We're the third biggest trading nation in the world, ahead of Japan, and the fifth biggest economy in the world. We're the headquarters of the Commonwealth, that voluntary association of English-speaking, self-governing nations, with members on 6 continents and almost a third of global population. So the claim that we'd be isolated outside the EU is pure, unadulterated nonsense. Just think of the benefits of reclaiming our independence by leaving the EU and joining that growing 94% of the world. First, trade. We already do 50% more of our trade outside the EU than with the EU.